This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Welcome to this episode of the podcast. Today, I'm joined by nutritional therapist and sustainable cooking expert, Sam Hamrebtan, to explore the vital connection between soil and the nutrients in our food. As the founder of the Life Larder newsletter and course director at CNM's Natural Chef School, Sam brings a wealth of knowledge on how growing practices impact the quality of what we eat. Sam talks about nourishing both the land and ourselves.
So I'm a nutritional therapist and a chef, and I actually spent over a decade working in media and advertising. And my last role there was as a head of training and talent. And I just had this kind of real itch to scratch that when we were giving people training, we were teaching them how to create beautiful PowerPoints or how to network well. And I'd always had a real love for food. I'm from Yorkshire originally, so I've grown up around lots of farmers and lots of gorgeous countryside and space, and had sort of grown in my grandparents' garden. And there was just something that didn't quite work for me. So I decided to take that a little bit further. And I thought, okay, if I can connect the dots between food and people, what's the frame here? So I was like, you know what, it's nutrition. It's got to be nutrition. There's got to be something in this. So I went off and I retrained and I studied. And whilst I was doing that, I was like, well, actually, I think there's something beyond just telling people what's good for them to eat. We also have to be putting our hands into the food. So I worked with lots of friends who were chefs. I was helping out wherever I could. So evenings, weekends, at supper clubs, events, retreats, and kind of got my chefing stripes and training just by working with lots of amazing people. And the people that I gravitated towards were really focused on food that was grown with love. And that can sound like quite a fluffy thing to say, but this idea that when food is cared for, when the earth and when the soil that somebody is pulling those beautiful carrots out of is in as good a shape as possible, that food really sings. It tastes way better. So kind of bringing this all together, I then was like, okay, right. So I've got this training background. I'm now trained to be a nutritional therapist, and I'm really keen on the chefing. How do I bring all this together? So the culmination of that was I've been running a cooking school for about 3 years, focusing on how we can truly support our bodies with good quality food. And I also founded a business called the Life Larder. And the Life Larder is a community where we share lots of different ideas. We share recipes for creating tasty, healthy, and sustainable meals, but also asking questions, right? Like, is there a way to eat meat sustainably? What is the best way to grow X, Y, and Z? So for me, it's all about taking people on that journey, educating people on beautiful food, on how important our soil is in particular to creating food that actually can support our bodies for years to come.
I was kind of thinking as you were talking about how I'd interviewed somebody before, and we were saying that there's no sort of scientific basis to it, but when you prepare food with love, it does taste better. And I don't know why or what the reasoning is, or if that's just kind of in your head. I'm not sure, and it doesn't really matter probably, but it's interesting that you say that food that's grown with love as well is just as important. So there's that aspect to it, but otherwise, why do you feel growing and harvesting our own food is better than, say, popping down to Tesco's and buying it?
I think that's a really good question. I think often when we buy food from a supermarket, we expect that food to be grown in the way that we would have grown it. We almost expect them to be growing all that food without chemical intervention in a way that we would grow in our garden. Instead of spraying chard, maybe we're going to try to take those snails off the chard very gently. Think of more natural ways to ensure that we still have a crop at the end. And I think there is this real disconnect between what we actually get in the supermarket in a lot of instances and what we think that should be. So, there's some really interesting statistics around this actually, and the fact that between 20 to 30% of us in the UK are trying to grow our own, more so since the pandemic. And I do think, the pandemic gave a lot of people a little bit of time to go, actually, maybe, I will try and grow some basil on my windowsill. Maybe I will, put some tomato seeds on a piece of tissue paper and start small. For people who don't grow, I think they could see that not only is it quite easy in some respects, but also that flavor. When you pick a tomato that you have grown versus buying a tomato in January in a supermarket, it is night and day, right? I'm not saying that everything on the supermarket shelves isn't good quality, because I do think there is some stuff there that is, but 84% of our food shopping in the UK is done in major stores. So I think there is an opportunity for us to ask for better, because we're putting lots of money into the supermarket's pockets, and that's fine. But I think once we've had that opportunity to taste something and we know what real good quality food should taste like, I think as consumers, we should feel confident to ask for more of that.
Yeah, and as you say, it is inarguably night and day if you eat something that's homegrown versus something that's been grown in a way, like you said, that we would not necessarily grow it at home. And is that to do with the soil, do you think, more than anything?
I personally think that. So I think in the supermarket, it's very easy to go, okay, we've got our regular carrots and then we've got our organic carrots. And organic in a supermarket, I think, gives us this kind of stamp to say this has been grown without harmful pesticides and herbicides. However, as we both know, there are so many incredible ways that we can grow that don't have to be organic, but can still be used to grow in ways that effectively aren't putting in those herbicides and pesticides. So there's a huge movement at the moment around regenerative farming and what this term means, right? How do we grow in a way that is a bit more in harmony with nature, but perhaps isn't full organic? And then we've got biodynamic. So I think there's so many different terms swirling around. But actually, we have to break free of the supermarkets to be able to find a lot of this food. A lot of this food is perhaps grown by people growing on allotments. And, if we're lucky enough to have people who sell their food at local allotments too, there's quite a few places around me where people do sell food from their allotments and veg box schemes. I think a lot of the time, if we begin to look local, we have that opportunity to go beyond what we necessarily see as supermarket, industrial farmed food versus organic, and open out into a world where actually we can support a local food ecosystem as well and local growing systems.
Yeah, I absolutely couldn't agree more. I think it has to be the way forward. And going back to the difference between the homegrown and what you might buy in, it's a little bit of a controversial topic, also I've found in the past. Is it your belief that the food that we grow at home is actually more nutritious than the stuff we might buy in?
I believe that if you are growing at home and you are growing without artificial chemicals and you are in control of what is going onto the fruits, the veggies, the plants that you are putting into your ground, you then know exactly what's there, right? Therefore, versus, and we're not given that list of what something's been sprayed with in a supermarket. So it could be that actually, it's a great year for strawberries, for instance. And so we end up with really good quality strawberries on the shelves that perhaps didn't need a lot of extra help. I think we have that opportunity in our own gardens, on our own windowsills, on our balconies, to make those decisions. And therefore, that can allow us to grow food that is more nutritious. And the reason I say that food is more nutritious, there's still not a lot of studies, but we are getting more and more of these studies. They're often around organically grown fruits and vegetables. But there was a study that looked at some organically grown fruit and vegetables versus intensively farmed. And it showed that there were higher levels of phytochemicals in those fruits and vegetables that had been grown organically. Now, phytochemicals are antioxidants that remove toxins from the body. They help with repair. And one of the reasons that we see more phytochemicals in our food is because when food is grown without chemical intervention, it has to work harder to survive in the soil. it has to create more of these phytochemicals to be able to protect itself and to exist within that ecosystem. So we're definitely seeing that actually, if something has had to fight a little bit harder, it's going to give us more nutrition versus something that perhaps has been given a lot of help with chemical fertilizers. So I know that's a roundabout way of answering your question, but I think growing at home gives us the choice, basically.
Actually, that's a very interesting point as well. If it's a year where strawberries have struggled, and for me, for example, last year we had tomato blight hit really early, so we didn't get the normal tomato crop that we might have done. But that's okay. So what we did that year was just had less tomatoes, whereas I think that a lot of people are in the mindset that, we should be able to go to the shop and buy what we want when we want it. And that supply should be fairly constant, even if that means people are growing them in a way that's really forcing them to produce. So that ties in with the whole eating seasonally thing, I think. Do we need to understand that actually some years we might just have a really rubbish apple harvest, and that's fine. We don't need to be flying them in. We just have to say that year, okay, fine, we'll have less apples.
In the UK, we are so used to seeing everything on our shelves all year round. We have lost this understanding of what seasonality is when we go to a supermarket. In Europe, it's very different. I was cooking out in Italy last year and I needed some fresh chilies. I was like, I can't find any anywhere. And I spoke to somebody that was working there and they said, well, we don't have any chilies yet because we just haven't had the weather for it. You're going to have to wait a few months. And we just have this disconnect here. We can always get chilies in the supermarket, right? We can get, this kind of classic example of tomatoes in winter, strawberries in December. They just shouldn't be there. And there are other places in the world that do say, do you know what? If you can't get it at this time of year, we're not going to put it on the supermarket shelves. So even though I think there is more of a move towards eating seasonally and more of an understanding of what seasonality is, I think as consumers, again, we kind of need the bigger players on the landscape to teach us a little bit more about it. I can't remember whether it was last year or the year before, but when I was talking to a commercial grower and he was saying that when they were putting in their cauliflower plugs, it was such terrible weather that the majority of the cauliflower plugs got washed away. So he's like, the price of cauliflower is going to double this year and there won't be as much of it. And these things, I think, need to trickle down to us all. We need to understand this, right? Because if we don't necessarily know, and we can think, okay, actually, summer is strawberries. But if it's a particularly tricky year and you don't get those strawberries or you don't get those tomatoes, understanding why is really important, particularly as our climate changes.
Yeah, and that's another good point. You mentioned obviously the price of cauliflowers and it will go up if it's a bad year. However, a lot of organic veg that you buy in shops, if that's what you choose to buy, is quite expensive. And I think you're quite concerned about making the most of buying produce in, but it not breaking the bank. How can we do that?
I think there's a couple of things we can do. And number one is obviously growing, right? No matter how small, if you can put something in the ground or on a windowsill and you can grow it yourself and make the most of it, I think that is a fantastic way to keep costs low. Buying less trendy things as well. So I always love it when I see spring greens, winter greens. And yes, they're not necessarily as prominent as things like spinach or kale that tend to be a little bit sexier and a bit, talked about a bit more. But these hardy greens are often way cheaper and they'll go a really long way. So I think looking for foods that perhaps aren't as trendy and prioritizing those as well, and being very cognizant that the price of things will fluctuate. And therefore, seasonally, we should be expecting, if you do really desperately want whatever it is at some time of year, we're in forced rhubarb season now, but understanding, okay, well, maybe I'll pay a little bit more for my rhubarb, but actually I'm going to then really lean into root vegetables where we can get a glut of roots, when we're in kind of winter and early spring for a really good price. So I think it is thinking about leaning into seasonality where we can.
I guess also leaning into trying new flavours and new combinations of food. And I have read some of your Life Larder and it is really good at highlighting things that actually I might not have considered at all. And I'm quite adventurous, I like to think, with what I cook. There's just some really good ideas on that. I mean, how can you encourage people to be a bit more experimental?
I think one of the things that often we don't think about is our peelings and then tops. So one thing that I really love to do is when we have young carrots is use those carrot tops as a carrot top pesto. And then again, you're thinking about the fact that you've got the carrot, you've got that beautiful vegetable, and if you can get hold of the tops, you can effectively make a sauce out of that. There's often, if we can buy the whole plant, and when you grow it, you're really precious over every single inch of it, right? Because you know how long it's taken you to grow or taken someone else to grow. But when you see it in the supermarket, opting to buy the things that still have the tops on, still have the peels. And we can, in the majority of cases, eat the peel on a lot of our fruit and veggies too. I always think about my mum wanting to peel her mushrooms and all that mushroom waste. Mushrooms are absolutely incredible. They sterilize the soil around them. We can eat all of the mushroom. But even if you did want to, for instance, peel those little petals off the mushroom, you can roll them in a little bit of flour, gluten-free flour, whatever your preference is, a little bit of olive oil, some herbs, roast them in an oven for about 20 minutes at 180, and you've got these beautiful, crispy little snacks. So there are ways to use all of this waste. And I very much believe that that's the way that we're able to, I guess, eat as sustainably as possible, but also keep our costs low by understanding how we can use all of that and bringing back our preserving techniques. There are so many incredible fermenters creating gorgeous content now. And I think if we get a little bit more creative with some of the things that maybe we think, okay, it's a bit on the turn in my fridge, what am I going to do with it? That fermentation, that way that we used to preserve, allows us to use those things and also lower our food waste.
Yes, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I love experimenting with things, and there's so many different ways of using things that you might not think are usable. And I had a really interesting interview with Mitch McCulloch, who's Mitch Grows on Instagram, and he really champions that use of every little bit of the veg that's edible. And I think the other thing is there's kind of two parts to that. One is that it's unusual and it's challenging, but the other part is it's actually quite exciting to think that you're experimenting with food and using it in different ways. And that brings in the concept, I think, of getting children involved in eating homegrown produce. Have you got any tips for making that kind of fun for them?
I think with children, the number one thing is to let them touch it, smell it, taste it. If they are involved in the process of creating something, whether it is blitzing up a smoothie with fruits that have gone mushy and you don't know what you're going to use them in, whether it's making little biscuits that perhaps include a little bit of butternut squash grated, as soon as they've seen it, even if it's something that they wouldn't normally eat on their plate, if they're involved in that process, they want to taste it because it becomes an experience. And I think with kids, but also, with adults, I think with all of us, if we can see something and we can see how that's been used in a different way, or we've been involved and put our hands on something, we want to taste it because we want to know a little bit more. We want that kind of another sense to come alive through, touch, taste, smell. I think if we can activate multiple senses with anybody that we're cooking with, it allows them to go, do you know what? I will try that. And then hopefully, if they tried one thing and they didn't hate it, they might go, do you know what? I'm going to try that other thing because it can't be that bad. So I think play, and I often think as adults, we forget about this idea of play. Gardening to me is play. You never know what's going to happen each season, each year. And again, putting our hands in the earth and connecting. I think as soon as we actually physically touch things, a lot of us spend a lot of time on devices now, right? But putting our hands in food, in soil, they're really similar concepts, and they allow us to bring back this idea of childlike play, which again fires all different sort of neurons in our brain and gets us excited.
There are a lot of people listening, I think, who will be already converted to growing their own veg, but there will also be people listening, I think, who, like I used to be, they love ornamental plants. That's fine, that's great if that's your thing. But if you could try and convince people who particularly might be very time poor, if you were to say, okay, try this one or two things and see how you get on with it, because it's easy, it's an easy win, and it's something that really might spark off an interest for you.
My absolute favorite thing is if you're time poor, if you're space poor, getting a pot Ideally, a decent sized pot that you can plant 3 or 4 different herbs that are complementary. And when I say that, it could be 4 things that you just can't find in your local shop that you really love the flavor of. But again, herbs are really easy to grow, right? At RHS Wisley, one of their growers in the World Food Garden has created something called a pasta pot. And I love this idea. So there was oregano in there was rosemary, there was marjoram, those kind of traditional Italian flavors. This idea that's kind of all those lovely complementary things together that you can then just go out to your garden or go to your windowsill and pick when you need them for a meal. So I think herbs are a great way for people to start. And also, herbs can look really gorgeous too. I think when they're growing together, they create this beautiful kind of visual melody. And I'm a real sucker anyway for vegetables and fruits over ornamentals. I just love the look of them. I think, red Russian kale, beautiful rainbow chard. When you see that growing, it is just a feast for the eyes. But I think herbs are a great way to go, do you know what? I can give this one pot, I can give this little bit of space, and then you're going to get that benefit. And from a nutritional point of view as well, herbs have often greater nutritional density in terms of vitamin and mineral potential than a lot of our fruits and vegetables. They tend to have more of that vitamin and mineral density. And, you think about the smell. When we smell a herb, often it will be more pungent, more potent than a vegetable. So we're getting a lot of extra great nutrition just by having that little bit of space for herbs.
Thank you to Sam for taking part in the interview, and thanks to you for listening. If you like this episode, I recommend checking out episode 257, Taste Your Garden, and 246, Urban Smallholding. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.